Hey, what's up, everybody, and welcome back to our Catching Up segment on the Tonic podcast. I'm one of your co-hosts, Alex Kapitko, and I'm coming to you guys from Madrid, Spain, where unfortunately right now I cannot say that the situation has gotten any better. In fact, it's most likely gotten much worse. So all I can say at this time is we need to keep our heads up, we need to keep looking forward, and we need to work together. And eventually we will get through this crisis. Today I'd like to touch on another element of the coronavirus that isn't getting enough attention. And I know we talk about this topic a lot, but it makes sense, right? This is something that is on everyone's minds, and there are so many layers on this cake of problems that are linked to this pandemic that there's always something new to talk about. I want to talk about something today that I think is a ticking time bomb in this pandemic story, and this is how the third world and developing world would react and be impacted by this pandemic. At the time that I'm recording this podcast, the main countries that have been impacted have been rich countries. Right now, the heaviest impacted countries are China, Italy, and the United States, with Spain and Germany following. China's a bit of an outlier because of its vast size and because it's a mix of old and new, modern and underdeveloped, and rich and poor. But these other countries are all first world countries with relatively wealthy populations, decent infrastructure, and stable governments. And looking ahead, the UN has already warned that this pandemic could leave an even bigger path of destruction in the world's most vulnerable and conflict-riddled areas. I'm very worried about what would happen in places like sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, parts of Asia, and even South and Central America if this virus took hold and balloons in growth. In the rich world, it already seems like governments cannot take care of their own. So what happens when you get to an entire country of poor and vulnerable people? According to an article by The Guardian's Nesreen Malik, he says in quotes, "It is the reoccurring theme of how the pandemic has played out so far. The poor, the uninsured, the disenfranchised, the information poor, and the less mobile are all sitting ducks." I think this is a valuable point to take in mind. It already seems like this coronavirus is exposing the fragility of society, and even the individuals within it. The virus has exposed the limitations of almost every Western healthcare system in the world, no matter what system they actually have implanted. It has also exploited weaknesses in the human body, bringing out its worst symptoms in those who are already vulnerable. And it's for these reasons that I think the developing world could be quite ravaged by this. For example, many sub-Saharan African countries are generally just fragile states in general, and this also happens in places like Central Asia, Central and South America. And to name just a few issues that could break these already fragile systems, these nations suffer from high malnutrition rates. They have high population densities. They have communal living, which would help transmission. They have a lack of access to clean water, as well as washing facilities. And maybe the worst of all is that they have fewer means of quick medical intervention. There are also fears of what would happen with this virus in overcrowded and war-torn communities, like refugee camps. There would be little hope of finding enough space to implement social distancing in overcrowded cities, so imagine how hard it would be in refugee camps. These are just a few of the alarming ways that could really hurt the world's most vulnerable. The other side of this same coin is that many of these mentioned countries have been torn apart by long-lasting conflicts and civil wars. According to Sterling Carter, a former aid worker in South Sudan's healthcare system has been completely destroyed over the last 7 years by the civil war. So I would find it hard to imagine that a country like this would also be able to survive a pandemic. South Sudan is not the only country with this situation unfolding, and they would need to rally a lot of resources that they just don't seem to have. Another scary reality is that poor countries wouldn't have the resources or political might to provide their populations with stimulus packages. We've seen a lot of governments in the West looking at bailouts for their corporations and citizens. This just wouldn't be the same in third world countries. These countries would be left on their own. One also has to worry about the elephant in the room, which is basically just transparency. It was recorded that after the Ebola crisis, some of the reasons as to why it may have spread so rapidly was because people were afraid to talk to authorities. And due to a lack of trust and faith in political institutions and authorities, Many of these cases would likely go underreported, and people would not talk to authorities about their situations. This would make it very hard to control a pandemic in a society such as this. Also, if history can be our guide to how severe this issue could get, we should take a look at the Spanish influenza that took place from 1918 to about 1919 and is considered one of the biggest pandemics in the history of man. According to the limited records from this period, 30% of the entire fatality of the Spanish flu came from a single country, which was India. I repeat, 30% of the entire fatality rates came from India. And though India today is not similar to every other developing country, I think it is more on the scale of China, where it's a country of contradictions. It does have a similar economic situation and population similarities as many of these developing countries now. The Spanish flu statistics also show that the American countries that had the biggest fatality rates were the ones that were exposed to the highest global flows of people and goods. Unfortunately, this hits home for places like Africa. The first cases in Egypt seem to have come from one cruise ship of wealthy foreign travelers. And as Drew and I have talked about many times on this podcast, China has become a global crossroads and a hub of globalization, especially for Chinese foreign direct investment, Chinese infrastructure projects, Chinese intelligence. And then there's also just national oil production. And so this has placed the region into the forefront of global movement. And this could be quite detrimental. So it'll be interesting to see how a continent like Africa that has grown very reliant on external forces is now going to potentially have to shut their borders. Now, I know that all of this sounds quite dark and depressing, to be quite frank. But it's true, there are going to be a lot of uncertain times going ahead. But to end on a positive note, there are already discussions about how the world could work together to help developing countries stay afloat. And this would require large amounts of global cooperation. But it does seem like some of these countries, if they're hit hard by the pandemic, would need something similar to a pandemic Marshall Plan that looks to bolster countries that lack the resources to combat their own health crises. And according to Foreign Policy magazine, this seems to already be happening. The United Nations is preparing to issue a major funding appeal, which is for more than $1.5 billion to prepare for outbreaks of this new coronavirus. They would look to invest in some of the worst humanitarian crises in the world, which would be such as Gaza, Myanmar, Syria, South Sudan, and Yemen. Now let's be honest, I think this plan is a great start, but $1.5 billion just is not enough. And the problem is that many of the world's leading economies are facing recessions. So I think it could be hard to get proper funding during this time. The Economist predicts that countries would need to use close to 5% of their GDP to combat the economic crises that are unfolding. And even with international help, I find it very hard to imagine developing countries could even get close to this. Now, like most of the topics that we bring up on the Tonic Accord, this issue is obviously not black and white. But I do think it could be the Achilles heel of this entire pandemic. I think down the road, Drew and I could definitely have a full discussion about this topic. But for now, I think it's an important topic to shine light on the fact that the poor and vulnerable are going to get hit hard by this. I know that many opponents of globalization are blaming globalization for the spread of this virus. And obviously that's probably correct, and we do need to have a discussion. But I think this is an issue that will require a global response. Potentially, one positive outcome of this pandemic could be that world leaders will realize that a nation is only as strong as its weakest links, and maybe the world is only as strong as its weakest countries. And with that, have a great day. Thank you for listening. Wash your hands and try to stay sane.